Hey guys, tonight we're heading somewhere warm, windy, and just a little more dramatic than your average island getaway ancient roads. Yep, that sunny little Greek island you might visit for beaches and olives today? Well, rewind the clock back over 2,000 years, and this place is doing something wild. Not content with just worshiping the sun, they decided to build a statue of it. Not a cute little altar either, I'm talking colossal. The kind of statue where you squint at the sky and realize, oh, that's not a cloud, that's his face. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment with your city and the time right now. I'd love to know who's falling asleep and who's still wide awake while we travel through history. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your sandals hit rough stone as you step onto the dock, the kind of cobblestone that doubles as a free exfoliator. Welcome to Rhodes. The air smells like sea salt, olive oil, and maybe fish that sat in the sun a little too long. The sun's just starting to set, but it's not in a hurry. No, it hangs there like it's putting on a show, pouring gold across the rooftops and soaking the city in heat. The city before you, Rhodes Town, is a jewel of the Hellenistic world. That's not marketing. That's what ancient travelers actually wrote in their diaries. This place is smart, wealthy, and, okay, maybe a little bit full of itself. Rhodes is booming. After the death of Alexander the Great, the island found itself smack in the middle of a fragmented, power-hungry world. But instead of picking sides, Rhodes leaned into trade. Ships from all over the Mediterranean dock here, bringing spices, fabrics, gossip, and sometimes spies. Stand on this dock long enough and you'll hear 5 different languages, 4 different currencies being argued over, and probably someone trying to sell you a sacred charm that was clearly made yesterday. But don't judge too fast. Walk a little deeper into town, and you'll see theaters, markets, temples, gardens, everything, laid out with almost mathematical precision, like someone took Plato's ideal city and tried to make it real. And everywhere you look, in every tiny street side shrine and grand marble column, there's one name being whispered: Helios. Yep, their main god isn't Zeus or Athena, it's Helios, the sun god. The big guy in the golden chariot, driving across the sky every day like it's his commute. He represents light, order, life, and let's be honest, a little cosmic ego. Now, you might be thinking, wait, isn't Apollo the sun god? Classic confusion. Scholars are still arguing about that. Some say Helios and Apollo were always separate. Helios drove the sun, Apollo played the lyre. Others say they eventually merged into one celestial golden boy. Honestly, ancient mythology is kind of like the Marvel universe lots of crossover, few consistent timelines. But for the people of Rhodes, it was never confusing. Helios was their god. He lit their harbor, blessed their crops, protected their ships. He wasn't just worshipped, he was lived. As you pass through the bustling agora, you see little kids drawing chariots with flame trails, their version of a hot rod. Potters etch Helios' crown onto clay jugs. That crown, by the way, the spiky sunray style, eventually inspired the Statue of Liberty's headpiece. History's full of strange fashion hand-me-downs. And you tonight, you're not just hearing about the Colossus of Rhodes. You're walking straight into its origin story. Not the myth, the moment, the decision, the spark. You move through the city gates just as the sun touches the horizon, casting long red shadows on the stone streets. The noise of the day begins to hush. Somewhere nearby, a prayer is being murmured. The whole city, in its own quiet way, bows to the sky. And you realize this statue wasn't some impulse project. It was centuries of devotion made solid. They didn't build a monument to show off. They built it because, for them, Helios was already there. This would just make him visible to everyone else. And so, your story begins. The ground is still warm under your feet, holding the last breath of sunlight as you make your way toward the city square. It's quieter now people have gone home. Shutters closed, oil lamps glowing softly behind carved wooden windows. But up ahead, in the open-air courtyard of the temple complex, there's a soft hum of voices and the unmistakable scratch of chisels on stone. You're about to witness the moment the idea takes root. Here's what happened. A few years back, Rhodes found itself in a bit of a tight spot. Antigonus I, one of the successors of Alexander the Great, decided Rhodes was getting too cozy with Egypt. And because ancient politics is basically a never-ending game of he looked at me funny, Antigonus sent his son Demetrius to lay siege to the island. That guy showed up with 44 zero troops, war engines, and the kind of ego you only get from inheriting your dad's kingdom. Spoiler, it didn't work. The siege lasted over a year, and Rhodes didn't just hold, they thrived under pressure. Through clever engineering, brave citizens, and maybe a little help from the weather gods, they pushed Demetrius out. Total David and Goliath energy. Except in this version, David not only salvages Goliath's gear and builds a monument out of it. And that's exactly what the Rhodians did. The war machines left behind battering rams, siege towers, giant catapults, they sold all of it. Every bolt, every plank of wood, every piece of bronze was either melted down or auctioned off. They made a fortune. And instead of throwing a victory festival and calling it a day, they did something that honestly screams ancient Greek logic. They decided to use the money to build the largest statue in the known world as a thank you gift to their god. I mean, you have to admire the energy. You're now standing in the square where city leaders once gathered scholars, priests, architects. The air feels heavy with ambition and incense. A scroll gets unrolled. A priest recites a dedication. Someone sketches a rough silhouette of what the statue could be. A young man raises his hand and says, "We'll need a sculptor." Someone else replies, "We know the perfect one." And just like that, the name Chairs of Lindos enters the room. Chairs isn't some random guy with a chisel. He trained under Lysippus, the personal sculptor of Alexander the Great. That's like learning photography from Annie Leibovitz. The man knows proportions, balance, and drama. He's already sculpted plenty of gods, but never anything like this. This is a chance to carve immortality out of bronze. Now, just to be clear, no one is saying, let's make it 33 meters tall and stand it at the harbor entrance with 1 foot on each side. That whole straddling the harbor image, that actually came much later, probably dreamed up by medieval travelers who really loved the idea of sailing between a giant's legs. In reality, most historians believe the Colossus stood solidly on one side of the harbor, likely on a stone platform perhaps near the fortress walls. Still ridiculously massive. Still utterly awe-inspiring. Just not a leggy welcome sign for incoming boats. You sit on a worn marble step and imagine what this must have felt, like turning the trauma of war into a divine gesture, taking destruction, literally melting it down, and reshaping it into something hopeful. There's something weirdly modern about that. Also, here's a fun side note. The word Colossus wasn't originally a proper noun. It just meant giant statue. This one was so famous that over time it hijacked the word entirely. Now, any giant statue is a Colossus, but this was the Colossus. Talk about legacy. Back in the square, the conversation shifts. People are calculating weight, material, support. Some worry the foundations will never hold. Others argue about which version of Helios to sculpt stern and powerful, or calm and benevolent. Should he be holding a torch? A spear? Should he wear a robe or be classically Greekly nude? Even in ancient times, design meetings were full of conflicting opinions. And of course, there's debate lots of it. Not just among citizens, but even today among scholars. Some believe the statue had a hollow bronze shell. Others think it had a stone core with bronze plates hammered onto it. No one can agree exactly how it was constructed, or even where the feet were planted. Archaeologists still argue over broken stone fragments, like they're trying to solve a cosmic jigsaw puzzle with half the pieces missing. But none of that matters to you right now. Right now, the voices around you fade as the image forms in your mind. A towering figure rising above the city, face turned toward the east, crowned with rays of light, casting shadows longer than buildings. You don't know it yet, but this statue will take 12 years to complete, and when it's finished, it'll stand for just as many 12 short years of glory. Then, one terrible morning, an earthquake will snap it at the knees. But let's not rush. For now, let it remain a dream in the minds of those who dared to build it. You rise from the step, the wind brushing past your face, carrying the scent of sea and metal. The work hasn't started yet, but the decision has been made. The next morning, the sky over Rhodes is a fresh shade of blue. So crisp, it looks like the gods just repainted it overnight. You're standing at the edge of the city, just above the harbor, on a bluff overlooking the sea. Below you, the ships look like little bronze toys scattered across the Aegean. But you're not here for the view, you're scouting the spot where one of the most ambitious construction projects in the ancient world is about to begin. Chairs of Lindo's arrive not long after you. He's already sweating, holding a bundle of scrolls, a chunk of clay, and what might be the ancient equivalent of a really intense to-do list. He glances up at the sun and squints. "Helios, buddy," he probably mutters. "You better appreciate this." You step aside as a few workers begin to clear the ground leveling the rock, measuring distances with ropes and stakes, marking spots with charcoal and broken tiles. It doesn't look like much yet, but in Chares' mind, the statue is already standing tall. He can see it. The curves of the limbs, the stance, the glint of sunlight off polished bronze. The man isn't just a sculptor, he's a visual architect with the patience of a monk and the ambition of a king. So how do you even begin to build something 30 meters tall in an age where scaffolding is basically wood and hope? Chairs has a plan, a clever one. Instead of building the statue from the outside in like you might with a clay model, he's going to build it from the ground up, one bronze plate at a time. They'll fill the statue with stone and iron as they go, using an internal scaffolding system that climbs higher and higher with the statue's height. It's a bit like building a skyscraper out of armor plates, while standing on stilts with no cranes. And also, your blueprints are hand-painted on goatskin. Piece by piece, the bronze arrives. Some of it is melted down from the weapons left by Demetrius's army. The irony of that is delicious. By the way, turning a siege tower into a sun god's thigh is the kind of poetic justice that should be printed on a t-shirt. The forge fires roar day and night. You can hear the bellows pumping from halfway across the city. Workers hammer sheets of bronze into curved panels. They lug them up wooden ramps and scaffolds, fixing them into place with iron clamps and rivets. The sound echoes off the harbor walls like thunder, and all of it, every clang and grind, is in the name of Helios. And here's the fun part. This is happening in the open. No hidden workshop, no secret mountain lair. Everyone in Rhodes can see the statue slowly rising above the rooftops. Kids keep count of how many toes have been finished. Tourists from nearby islands arrive just to gawk and squint at the scaffolding. A rumor even starts that if you whisper a wish to the statue before it's completed, Helios will hear it more clearly, like leaving a voicemail for a god. Meanwhile, Chares is basically living on site. He eats, sleeps, and probably dreams right next to this growing bronze giant. And while he's the head of the project, this isn't a solo gig. There's a small army of laborers, metalworkers, engineers, and stone haulers behind him. Ancient construction is very much a group project with all the shouting and teamwork breakdowns that implies. Also, let's not forget the animals. Donkeys, oxen, and mules help transport materials up and down the slope. It's not exactly glamorous work. One donkey, affectionately nicknamed Heli Ass by the workers, no really, becomes something of a local mascot. Historians probably made that part up, but hey, sounds plausible enough. Now, while you're watching this unfold, you may wonder, what does Helios think of all this? Well, we don't have divine confirmation, but Rhodes definitely believed he approved. Priests hold regular ceremonies during the construction offerings of wine, incense, honey cakes. Every milestone is marked with a prayer. Every stone laid is a kind of devotion. This isn't just architecture, it's worship, one bronze panel at a time. And yet, not everyone's convinced it'll work. Some citizens whisper doubts in the marketplaces. Will the weight collapse the foundations? What if the bronze cracks in the heat? Should they have spent the money repairing the harbor instead? Classic project management drama. And yes, scholars still debate how Chares actually pulled this off. We have no surviving blueprints, no photographs, obviously, just fragments of descriptions and poetic guesses. Some argue that internal supports were made of stone-filled wooden beams. Others think there was a spiral staircase inside. One theory even claims that the base was hollow, and priests could enter to offer prayers from within the god's very feet. That's some next-level devotion. But despite the doubts, the statue continues to rise. The legs are completed first, each one wide enough to make you feel like you're standing next to a moving building. The torso begins to take shape, rippling with muscular detail. By now, Helios's waist towers above the tallest houses, and it's only halfway done. You lie back on the grass, the sound of hammers in the distance, the smell of hot metal drifting on the wind. For a brief moment, you imagine what it will feel like when it's finished. When the sun rises behind his crown and lights up the entire harbor like a spotlight from the gods, yeah, it's gonna be spectacular. You wake up to the rhythmic beat of hammers and the low, steady creak of wooden scaffolding swaying gently in the morning breeze. The Colossus has grown a lot. When you squint up from the base, you can just barely see the curve of the chest forming. From down here, it looks like someone took a mountain and gave it abs. It's been several years since construction began. The workers have aged, so have you. But the statue is timeless. Every day, it inches closer to completion. One bronze panel, one heaved up boulder at a time. And now, it's time for the head. This, you quickly learn, is not just a structural challenge, it's a philosophical one. See, it's not enough for Helios to be tall, he also has to be majestic, dignified, possibly even a little smug. After all, this is the face of Rhodes' protector, the god of the sun and, arguably, the most Instagrammable thing in the Eastern Mediterranean 2,000 years before Instagram. Chares paces in circles around a massive slab of stone where the first clay mock-ups of the head are being modeled. He squints, he frowns, he mutters things like, no, the nose should be more divine, less goatish. You stand nearby, holding a bronze ear the size of a shield, wondering what divine ears are supposed to look like. This is the phase where the artistry takes center stage. Chares isn't just building big, he's building beautiful. He wants Helios to look calm, wise, a little otherworldly. Not angry, not warlike, and definitely not bored. It's a fine balance, trying to sculpt a god that looks like he knows everything without making him look like he just ate a weird fig. Oh, and that crown? It's a radiating sunburst of spiked halo that glints in the daylight and glows at sunset. 7 rays, if the poets are to be believed. Or maybe 12, depends on who's counting. There's still debate over that detail. Some scholars believe the crown was made of gold leaf to catch the sunlight. Others say it was just polished bronze, but tilted perfectly to reflect light like a beacon. You get to help haul one of the rays up the scaffold today. It's terrifying. The wind tugs at the ropes, the bronze is heavier than it looks. At one point it slips a little and everyone collectively stops breathing. But somehow, with enough yelling and enough faith in pulleys, the piece locks into place. You lean back and gaze up. Helios now has a face. And here's a weird thing you notice. No eyes. Or rather, empty eyes. Deep sockets, not yet inlaid. For now, it gives the statue a hollow, slightly haunted look like a sleeping titan waiting to wake. Some say the eyes were later filled with gleaming gemstones, perhaps emerald or obsidian, to give them that otherworldly shine. Others believe they were just smooth, polished bronze, catching the morning light like 2 fiery stars. Again, we don't know for sure. The real details, like so many things in ancient history, are as lost as yesterday's sunset. But standing here now, amid the chaos of ropes and bronze and shouted instructions in ancient Greek, one thing is clear. The Colossus isn't just a statue anymore. It's a symbol, not just of victory or of piety, but of persistence. Is what happens when a city refuses to stay broken. There's a cold drink waiting for you down at the harbor, some kind of diluted wine with herbs floating in it, probably rosemary or thyme. You take a sip and look up at the statue again. From this distance, the crown is visible, sharp against the blue sky, and a bird is circling near the shoulders, unsure if this giant counts as a mountain or a rival. Almost done, someone says beside you. Almost, but not quite. There's still the pose to finalize, the balance, the sense of movement. Did you know ancient statues were rarely stiff? Chares especially was trained in the art of contrapposto, a gentle twist of the body that makes even giants look like they could step down and walk away at any moment. That's what's happening here. Helios isn't just standing. He's shifting his weight, chest turned ever so slightly, one leg forward like he's about to descend from the heavens to take a stroll through the agora. It's subtle, but it changes everything. Oh, And remember that classic image of Helios holding a torch in one hand? Yeah, that was probably made up much later. Scholars think he actually held something closer to a cloak or a spear. Nothing at all. The original accounts don't agree, which, if you're keeping score, is basically the motto of ancient history. We think it was this, but it might have been the opposite. As the sun begins to dip toward the horizon, the light hits the crown just right, making the bronze sparkle like it's lit from within. For a moment, you understand why the Rhodians picked this project. This wasn't just a monument to a god, it was a way to put themselves back on the map. You take a deep breath. The breeze smells like salt and olives and hot stone. The workers are packing up for the night. The scaffolding creaks quietly as it cools. The statue stands tall, watching, waiting, almost finished. The next few weeks pass in a blur of bronze and blisters. You've lost track of how many rivets you've hammered, how many baskets of sand you've hauled, or how many times you've heard someone yell, "Watch the pulley," only to see a worker dangling midair like an angry fruit. But one morning, the air feels different. Still heavy, like the city itself is holding its breath. Because today, the final piece goes up. You're standing near the base of the statue, which now looms so far above you that Helios's head vanishes into the bright Rhodian sky. The scaffolding creaks and sways in the wind, now a precarious web of ramps, ladders, and platforms wrapped tightly around the god's massive torso and arms. One last piece, smooth curved bronze panel meant for the back of the shoulder is waiting on the cart beside you. It doesn't look special. In fact, it looks a little boring. But it's not what it is, it's where it's going. Once it's in place, the Colossus will be complete. 33 meters of muscle, metal, and monumental ambition, standing proudly above the harbor, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the horizon. You grab one of the ropes, up you go, and let's be honest at this point, even the gods are probably nervous. It's been over a decade since Chairs of Lindos first broke ground on this project. That's 10 years of political drama, budget overflows, material delays, and, at one point, a sheep shortage. Long story, involving a festival, and a very confused flock. But now, every eye in Rhodes is fixed on the rising sun god. It takes hours. The ropes jam, the pulleys groan, a plank splits, someone almost drops a hammer from 20 meters up. There's a moment where your foot slips and your heart forgets how to beat. But then, you hear it. That last satisfying click, as the panel locks into place. There's a pause, and then cheers. From the workers, from the harbor, from the cliffs overlooking the city. It spreads like fire through the streets it's finished. The Colossus of Rhodes stands complete. You climb back down slowly, every muscle sore, every joint aching, but your chest light and hollow with awe. When you finally reach the ground and turn around, it hits you all over again. He's enormous. He's beautiful. And he is absolutely not straddling the harbor. Yeah. Sorry to burst the myth bubble, but no, despite the classic image you've probably seen in books or cartoons, the Colossus did not stand with one foot on each side of the harbor entrance, boats passing between his legs like some kind of maritime gynecologist. That would have been logistically impossible. Scholars agree he most likely stood just beside the harbor, possibly on a stone platform or hill, towering above the entrance like a watchful guardian. But that didn't stop the legends from blooming. And honestly, who can blame the storytellers? From a distance, the statue looks impossible. He's wrapped in a flowing bronze robe, one arm lifted, possibly shading his eyes, possibly hailing the sun, the other resting near his side. His face is serene, stern, but kind. The crown of rays circles his head like a halo of pure fire. When the sun hits him just right, it's hard not to believe he is the sun. Tourists from all over the Mediterranean start pouring into Rhodes. You see them everywhere, leaning out of boats, sketching in notebooks, arguing about whether Helios is smiling or smirking. Merchants set up stalls selling bronze figurines, Helios-themed trinkets, and, strangely, Helios-shaped pastries. They taste like sesame and regret. But what's really wild is how quickly the Colossus becomes a part of daily life. He's a constant presence now, always watching, always gleaming. People leave offerings at the base. Couples meet under his feet. Children play in the shadow of his sandals, pretending to be miniature gods. The statue becomes a kind of celestial timekeeper. In the morning, the light hits the crown and flares across the city. At midday, the sun is directly above, casting a tight ring of shadow around the base like a sundial. At sunset, the entire harbor glows as if the god himself is exhaling gold. And the pride of Rhodes? Off the charts. People start calling themselves children of Helios. The city's coinage features his radiant face. Philosophers compose odes. Sculptors weep openly while trying to copy his foot. A local poet, somewhat drunk, famously writes, "He is the sun made solid, and we are but ants in his warmth." Meanwhile, Chairs of Lindos vanishes from public life. No grand parade, no victory speech, just disappears. Some say he died shortly after the project ended. Others claim he retired, quietly, to the countryside, tired of fame and covered in bronze dust. And of course, there's the persistent rumor that he was so crushed by a minor mathematical error in the left wrist that he fled the city in shame. But you're still here. And every morning, when the light first peeks over the sea and Helios' shadow stretches across the rooftops, you feel it again. That sense that you've witnessed something extraordinary, that you helped give shape to a god, and that even if you forget everything else, the hammers, the bruises, the questionable donkeys, you'll never forget the first time you looked up and saw him standing there. Days pass, then weeks, then months, and the Colossus of Rhodes just stands there. You'd think, after all that fanfare, something dramatic would happen. A lightning strike, maybe, or a dove landing poetically on his shoulder. But nope, he just exists all silent bronze, and somehow that's more impressive than fireworks. He doesn't do anything, and yet he changes everything. You find yourself walking past him every day, partly out of habit, partly out of awe. He becomes a kind of anchor, a reminder. The way a mountain doesn't ask for attention, but you always notice it. And while he doesn't move, the world around him definitely does. Rhodes flourishes, trade booms. Foreign dignitaries arrive, eager to gawk at the statue and pretend to understand Greek wine customs. You overhear one particularly red-faced senator from Rome say, "It's lovely, but wouldn't it be better with columns?" His guide gives him a look that could sour milk. Meanwhile, the Rhodians lean hard into the branding. The Colossus shows up on coins, pottery, theater masks. Someone even starts selling miniature statues made of carved olive pits. Tourists eat them up. Literally, in one case, turns out not everyone knows olives have pits. The harbor thrives. Ships bring in goods from Egypt, spices from the east, gossip from Athens. Rhodes becomes more than just a port, it's a destination. You start seeing more sandals and fewer swords, more scholars than soldiers. A philosopher sets up daily lectures beneath Helios' feet, using the statue's shadow to time his rants. And every once in a while, a whisper passes through the crowd. Is this the eighth wonder? Which is bold, because the 7 wonders list isn't even fully agreed upon yet. You know how people are. Some lists include the walls of Babylon. Some say the lighthouse of Alexandria barely counts. One poet swears the list should be 1, Helios, 2, Helios, 3, Helios, and so on. You just enjoy the breeze from the sea and the way the bronze gleams at dusk. One night, lying on the slope of the hill above the harbor, you stare up at the Colossus against the star-filled sky. His outline is sharp, cutting into the darkness, like someone took a blade and carved him out of the universe itself. You wonder what he thinks about, if anything. Does a statue know it's famous? Or is he just a very tall, very quiet roommate you happen to share an island with? And then there's the dreams. Not yours, necessarily, but everyone else's. Because the statue, oddly, becomes a kind of spiritual symbol. People begin to whisper that seeing it in your dreams is a sign of good luck. Others claim Helios has appeared to them at night, offering cryptic advice like, "Do not trust the man with the crooked belt," or "Avoid lentils on market day." It becomes fashionable to say you've dreamt of Helios. A baker claims he saw the god high-fiving Apollo. A fisherman says Helios warned him of a bad storm, and sure enough, the sea turned rough a day later. You're pretty sure one kid just described the statue breakdancing in his dream. No one questions it. There's something soothing about it, honestly. In a world where war can show up like a bad dinner guest and earthquakes are just part of the seasonal background noise, having a giant sun god looking over you feels comforting, like an enormous cosmic nightlight. But don't think life on Rhodes becomes perfect. There are still squabbles. Someone argues the statue should have been wearing armor. Another says the nose is too attic. A small group insists Helios should have had a beard. The beard controversy makes it into a couple of comedy plays. And yet, the statue endures. He doesn't blink, he doesn't speak, but you get the sense that he's listening, that he's watching, that somehow this frozen god in bronze has managed to do what most leaders only dream of: inspire loyalty, unity, and a weird amount of merchandise sales. One afternoon, you overhear two children arguing about who would win in a race, Helios or Hercules. One says Hercules is stronger. The other just points at the sky and says, Helios is the sky. You decide not to get involved. Later, you find yourself sketching. Not the statue itself, you've done that 100 times, but how it makes you feel. It's hard to explain, like standing next to a myth, like you're a part of something bigger than yourself. And maybe that's the point. Because yes, the Colossus is a marvel of engineering, a feat of metalwork, a political statement in bronze. But more than anything, he's a message carved into the skyline. We are still here, and we made this. As the sun begins to set, the golden light washes across Helios's face. For a moment, just a moment, it looks like he's smiling. But you know better. He's always been smiling. You're halfway through your morning bread, slightly burnt, as usual when you hear it. A dull, rhythmic boom. Then another. Not urgent, not chaotic, just deliberate. Like a heartbeat echoing through the harbor. You step outside, squinting against the sun, and follow the sound. Turns out, you're not alone. Half the neighborhood's out on the streets, eyes turned inland. And that's when you see it. A line of elephants. Real ones. With painted foreheads and shiny bells and ears flapping in rhythm. Marching down the causeway, their enormous feet striking the ground with each resonant thud. Behind them, a sea of soldiers. Spearmen, archers, banners fluttering, bronze catching the light. Oh, right. You'd almost forgotten. This is a world where empires don't just write angry letters. They come visit in person with animals. The Seleucid king, Demetrius, the same guy whose failed siege inspired the Colossus in the first place, has a nephew now, and he's got ambitions, and elephants, and a really tall hat. You think it's a symbol of power, or maybe he just likes feeling closer to Helios. Rhodes is officially neutral, peaceful. But neutrality is a tricky business when your harbor is one of the busiest in the Mediterranean and your statue is famous enough to have fan fiction. So naturally, everyone wants a piece of you. And this new envoy from the Seleucid Empire isn't exactly subtle. They're not attacking, not yet, but they're definitely looming. You're summoned to a public assembly. The usual voices are there: merchants, military leaders, temple officials, a guy who somehow always ends up talking about grain prices even when the topic is elephants. There's tension in the air, like someone's wound the city tight and is just waiting for it to snap. And the Colossus? Still there, still silent. Some argue the statue is a target, that it draws too much attention, that it makes Rhodes look arrogant. Others say it's a shield, a warning to anyone thinking of messing with a city that once turned siege engines into scrap metal and had the nerve to build a sun god out of it. You sit at the edge of the crowd, listening, watching, wondering, and later that night, while the city quiets, you sneak back down to the base of the statue. It's cooler now. The stars are bright. Helios rises up in front of you like a shadow stitched into the sky. You lean against the plinth and look up, hoping for a sign. A shooting star, a convenient owl, anything. Instead, you get a seagull. It lands with a soft whomp on Helios's arm, stares at you for a beat, and then poops. So much for divine omens. Still, the city holds its breath. For weeks, the Seleucid envoys stay. They throw banquets, they send diplomats, they hold friendly demonstrations of elephant choreography, but Rhodes is used to this. The island's been a trading hub, a naval power, and a diplomatic headache for centuries. So the Rhodians do what they always do best: smile politely and stall. You help organize a series of cultural exchanges, which are mostly just excuses to get the Seleucids drunk and lost in the market district. One guy spends 3 days trying to find his sandal. It becomes a local legend. Meanwhile, the statue watches, unbothered, unmoving, but ever present. You start to notice how people treat him during times of stress. They touch the base gently when they walk past. They leave coins, flowers, folded scraps of parchment. One child gives him a pebble. No reason. Just felt right. And then, one morning, the elephants are gone. No battle, no treaties, just gone. Apparently, the Seleucid prince had urgent matters back east. Rumor says he was spooked by an eclipse, or by the statue, or by the fact that a goat licked his sword hilt during a speech. History's unclear, but Rhodes, still standing. You celebrate, quietly. The city doesn't throw a festival too obvious, but the bakeries sell out by noon, and someone plays a lyre under Helios's knee until sunrise. You sit beside them, tapping your foot, eyes on the bronze god's face, and you realize something. The Colossus doesn't just represent Rhodes. He is Rhodes, unyielding, watchful, capable of casting a shadow over threats without ever lifting a hand. And as the wind shifts and the morning sun paints the harbor gold, you swear just for a heartbeat, you see Helios wink. You're leaning against a crate of fish when you hear someone say the phrase that always means trouble. So, hear me out. You turn your head. It's Lysander, the local idea guy. Every town has one. The sort of person who once tried to domesticate a pelican and thinks olives are a personality trait. He's huddled with a small group of craftspeople, gesturing wildly toward the harbor and, of course, toward the Colossus. They say we built him once, he's saying, but I say we build more. What if statues of the other gods? A Colossus family? Maybe even one on wheels? You back away slowly. You've heard enough. It's been years since the Colossus was completed, but the statue still dominates every conversation, every artistic sketch, every sales pitch involving a badly drawn son with abs. It's become a cultural phenomenon memes before memes were a thing. Even your grandmother, who once called him a waste of bronze, now keeps a tiny Helios statue next to her olive press. But something's shifting. You feel it in the air, in the ground, even in the sea. The Colossus might not be changing, but the world around him is. There's talk of building up, taller homes, watchtowers, even rumors of a second harbor entrance. The old guard grumbles, but the new generation, the ones who grew up in the shadow of Helios, want more. They want bigger. They want to keep pushing. And that's not all. You hear whispers, actual whispers soft, whether the statue is starting to lean. It's just an illusion, says one sailor. He's settling, says another. He's breathing, says a third. You quietly note to never eat what that guy's eating. You decide to take a closer look. At dawn, you climb up the same path the workers once used during construction. The scaffolding's long gone, but the route remains. It takes effort. Your thighs will file a formal complaint later, but eventually, you reach the base and press your hand against the bronze. It's warm, not just from the sun either. It feels alive, solid, steady, but you can't help noticing the faintest sound of shifting earth beneath your feet. Rhodes sits on fault lines. You know this. Everyone does. It's like living in a lovely house next to a snoring bear. You pretend it's fine until the bear rolls over. And then, one evening, a philosopher gives a speech under the statue. He says, "Is permanence an illusion? Even gods fade. Even bronze rusts." You want to disagree. You want to shout, "But he's still here." Instead, you just stare at Helios, tall against the stars, and wonder if the philosopher's right. Still, life moves. Rhodes thrives. Theater blossoms. Art takes off. Someone writes a play where the Colossus comes to life and opens a juice stand. It's a hit. More ships arrive, some just to see the statue. You meet a traveler from Gaul who doesn't speak Greek but points at Helios and says, "Big shiny god." You nod. That about sums it up. And yet, there's a restlessness. like the island knows something is coming. One afternoon, an engineer, quiet, serious woman named Callistasks, if you've ever thought about reinforcement. Bronze is strong, she says, but not forever. Not with this much stress on the ankles. You laugh. She doesn't. You help her study the base. Sketch the joints. She makes notes, frowns, mutters something about wind pressure. He's holding, she finally says, but just barely. If there's a quake, you both trail off. And in that silence, you realize something. The Colossus wasn't meant to last forever. Nothing is. He was built in defiance of destruction, not to stop it, but to answer it. To say, we were here, we rebuilt, we rose. Maybe that's all monuments really are. Not declarations of power, but echoes of resilience. That night, you sit by the harbor and watch the moonlight dance on Helios's face. He still looks the same. Strong, confident, eternal. But now, you know better. Even Choltscan bobble. Hey, so imagine this. One day, while you're strolling along the harbor, someone taps your shoulder. It's an old merchant, eyes twinkling behind a thick beard, holding a scroll stained with who knows what. He tells you a story, one that sounds more like a myth than history. Apparently, right after the Colossus was finished, Rhodes started attracting an unusual kind of visitor. Not just traders or dignitaries, but philosophers, poets, and even pranksters who claimed the statue was magical. You raise an eyebrow. Magical? You'd expect fire-breathing dragons or talking trees, but a giant bronze statue? Still, the merchant insists. According to him, the Colossus wasn't just a landmark, it was a beacon, a kind of sun magnet, pulling in all sorts of odd energies. People swore that on certain days, when the sunlight hit Helios just right, the statue's shadow would move on its owner, that it whispered ancient secrets carried by the wind. You can't help but chuckle. Sounds like one of those tales meant to keep children from wandering into the harbor at night. Yet, there's a grain of truth buried in it. Because Rhodes quickly became a hotspot for, let's say, unusual experiences. Take the philosopher Thales of Miletus, who reportedly visited the island and marveled not just at the engineering, but at a peculiar optical effect. When the sun rose in a particular way, the statue's bronze shimmered so brightly that sailors would swear they saw a second sun dancing on the waves. This double sun sparked debate. Was it a trick of light, a natural phenomenon, or a sign from the gods? Scholars argue to this day. Meanwhile, local storytellers spun tales of Helios himself descending at night, strolling among the people disguised as a humble fisherman. One version says he'd help a poor man find lost treasure. Another claims he'd mess with drunkards by swapping their sandals. This idea of a living god mingling with mortals wasn't new in Greek culture, but the Colossus seemed to inspire a whole new wave of such stories. Some say it was a way for people to cope with the statue's immense presence, a way to make the monumental more relatable. And then, there's the less talked about phenomenon, the statue's peculiar effect on sleep. People reported vivid dreams after spending time near the harbor. Dreams filled with sunlit paths, golden chariots, and whispered messages. One particularly vivid account tells of a young woman who dreamed of Helios guiding her through a labyrinth of stars, only to wake with a mysterious symbol etched in sand near her bed. Scientists and historians debate whether these were just coincidences, the result of warm nights and salty air, or something more mystical. No consensus exists. You yourself can't help but feel a strange calm whenever you sit beneath the statue at sunset. It's as if the bronze figure absorbs the day's worries, letting you breathe a little easier. Yet, beneath this calm, a quiet tension hums. You overhear sailors whisper about strange shadows moving just beyond the harbor at dusk, and fishermen speak of compasses spinning wildly near Helios's feet. Could the statue's immense presence somehow be affecting the very fabric of the island? Or is it just the imagination of a people who needed a little magic in their lives? One thing's for sure. Whether through light, legend, or some unknown force, the Colossus of Rhodes had become more than metal and myth. It had become a living part of the island's spirit, a silent guardian whose mysteries would keep minds wandering long after the sun had set. You're wandering the bustling market square when an elderly artisan calls you over. His hands, rough from years of sculpting, clutch a small, worn-out model of the Colossus. He looks at you with a knowing smile, and says, "Let me tell you about the secrets behind the statue's creation." Turns out, the Colossus wasn't just built with brute force and bronze. The process was a delicate dance of innovation, engineering, marvels, and a few lucky breaks. The sculptor, Chairs of Lindos, wasn't just some artist with a hammer and chisel. He was a mastermind who combined art with science, philosophy with practical know-how. You learn that he designed the statue hollow inside a surprising choice that made the colossal figure lighter and less likely to collapse under its own weight. Imagine that, a giant hollow bronze god standing tall over a city of hardworking folk. You find this fascinating, but the artisan leans in and whispers something unexpected. Not everyone agrees on how he did it. Some historians say the statue was built in pieces and assembled on site. Others believe it was cast from the ground up, which would be an incredible feat for the time. You nod, because debates like these are the heartbeat of history. The exact method remains a mystery, locked away in the sands of time, in the silence of the ruins. But here's a cool tidbit the artisan share saw a cold little nugget buried in history. During construction, they recycled old weapons from the defeated sea iron, bronze, even bits of armor to make the Colossus. So, in a way, the statue was a giant melting pot of victory. A monument built not just from bronze, but from the spirit of defiance. You pause and imagine its soldiers dropping their swords, smiths melting down relics of war, all blending into a giant sun god who would forever watch the harbor. There's also talk about the statue's unusual pose. Unlike other statues, Helios stands with legs apart, seemingly straddling the harbor's entrance. But some archaeologists argue this might be a myth, born from later stories, since physically the harbor wasn't wide enough. The debate goes on. You lean back and grin. Just like the rest of the Colossus' story, the details are as much legend as fact. What's certain is that Share's vision brought the island together. The entire community pitched in miners, sculptors, sailors, and ordinary citizens each, contributing something to build the greatest statue the world had ever seen. You think about the sheer scale of that effort, and how, even today, the statue represents not just a god, but the pride and resilience of a people who dared to dream big. And as the sun sets behind the marketplace, you realize the Colossus' story is as much about human ingenuity as it is about divine power. Because sometimes, the gods aren't just figures in the sky, they're the hands and hearts of those who build. You find yourself at the edge of the harbor one early morning, watching the sun rise slowly over the water when a group of travelers approaches. They're scholars and artists from far-off lands, drawn by stories of the Colossus and Rhodes' reputation. Among them, a young historian named Callimachus strikes up a conversation with you. He's obsessed with the statue's fate. No one knows for sure, he says, eyes gleaming with that scholarly intensity that can only come from too much coffee and too many dusty scrolls. But we do know it didn't last forever. You nod, expecting the usual destroyed by an earthquake story. But Callimachus dives deeper, recounting tales you hadn't heard before, like how the statue supposedly stood for only about 54 years before it was felled. Some say the earthquake struck at dawn, a sudden, violent shaking that cracked the bronze and toppled Helios like a giant tree, he explains. Others suggest a slow decay over time weakened the foundations. The truth is, we don't really know. He pulls out a worn map marked with various ancient accounts, showing conflicting dates and descriptions. The uncertainty is maddening, but also kind of thrilling. Then comes the oddest part. After the fall, the statue's remains weren't just discarded or lost. No, they became a sort of legendary relic. People came from across the Mediterranean to see the colossal bronze pieces, which reportedly lay scattered near the harbor for centuries. You're picturing huge bronze limbs lying around, like a giant's forgotten toys. Even more fascinating, a traveling Arab historian centuries later wrote that the pieces were so valuable that a single caravan of camels was needed just to haul away the bronze scrap. Yet, some argue this is just a tall tale. How accurate can it be that bronze parts of such size were carted off intact? Were they melted down, sold off, or maybe hidden? Callimachus shrugs. History loves a good mystery, and that mystery is still debated in academic circles. The exact details of the statue's collapse and what happened afterward remain elusive, like trying to catch sunlight in your hand. But what strikes you most is the idea that Even in ruin, the Colossus remained a symbol. Its fragments carried stories, inspiration, and a hint of magic. You walk away from Callimachus's camp, eyes drawn to the harbor's calm surface. Some say the sea still holds a piece of Helios, a whisper of bronze beneath the waves, forever guarding Rhodes in silence. You smile and think, maybe that's how legends never really die, they just change form, becoming part of the world in ways we can't always see. One lazy afternoon, you find yourself in a quiet corner of a tavern, nursing a cup of honeyed wine. The usual chatter fades as an elderly storyteller known as Damaris begins weaving tales about the Colossus's mysterious influence beyond Rhodes. She leans in close, voice low and conspiratorial. "Did you know," she says, "that the Colossus inspired more than just awe? It sparked envy, ambition, even fear." You sip your wine, intrigued. Apparently, news of the giant bronze god spread across the ancient world, stirring the imaginations of rulers and architects alike. Some attempted to mimic Rhodes's masterpiece, trying to outdo it with statues of their own gods or heroes. One of the most curious copies was the Colossus of Apollonia, a lesser-known statue rumored to have been so tall it cast a shadow over an entire city. Though no remnants survived, the story suggests a sort of bronze arms race was underway, with cities competing to prove their might through colossal monuments. But Damaris's favorite tale involves an emperor from a faraway land who supposedly feared the power such symbols gave their cities. He worried that if people worshipped giant gods made of bronze, they might forget their loyalty to him. So, legend has it, he sent spies to Rhodes, hoping to uncover the statue's secrets and perhaps sabotage the city's pride. You're skeptical but can't help marveling at how a statue, just a statue, could provoke such political intrigue and paranoia. On a lighter note, Damaris tells you about some quirky rituals locals developed around the Colossus. For instance, newlyweds would toss tiny coins into the harbor, hoping Helios's gaze would bless their marriage with warmth and prosperity. There's even a bizarre tale of a prankster who climbed the statue's base one night and left a pair of sandals tied together, presumably as a joke that the god had lost his feet. Historians debate the accuracy of these stories, of course. Some say they're simple folklore, others believe they carry kernels of truth about how everyday people related to such an overwhelming monument. You think about how human nature hasn't changed much, whether it's envy, fear, love, or humor. These feelings echo across millennia. The Colossus wasn't just a god standing tall. It was a mirror reflecting the hopes and quirks of an entire society. As the tavern's fire crackles and the night deepens, you feel the weight of that truth settle in a reminder that history is alive not just in stone and bronze, but in stories shared over warm drinks and quiet evenings. Hey, now imagine it's twilight, and you're walking through the narrow, cobbled streets of Rhodes. The sun has dipped low, casting long shadows that stretch like lazy cats across the walls. Somewhere in the distance, a stray dog barks softly, and the salty sea breeze carries whispers of the past. You stumble upon an ancient library, tucked away in a quiet courtyard, where scholars pore over scrolls and worn manuscripts. One of them invites you to sit and share what they call the Colossus's shadow stories tales, that didn't make it into the official histories but still cling to the edges of memory. Here's where it gets a bit weird. Some accounts claim that the Colossus had a sort of shadow twin, not a real one of course, but a dark shape cast by the statue that seemed to have a life of its own. Local fishermen told of evenings when the statue's shadow stretched beyond the harbor, flickering and twisting as if it were dancing with the stars. At times, the shadow was said to grow longer or shorter in impossible ways, even creeping up walls or stretching across the water like a living thing. You might chuckle, thinking it's just light playing tricks, but the more you listen, the more you wonder. One scholar even suggests that these stories were ancient attempts to explain natural optical illusions caused by the statue's towering height and the shifting sun. But not everyone agrees and believes these shadow tales hint at a lost layer of meaning, perhaps even a ritual or secret message encoded in the way the Colossus interacted with light and space. Another curious detail. A fragment of a poem discovered in a nearby ruin describes Helios as a guardian who walks not in form but in shade, which some interpret as a metaphor for the statue's enduring presence, even after its fall. Historians remain divided on this. Did the statue's shadow inspire spiritual beliefs? Or are we just projecting fanciful stories onto natural phenomena? You lean back and realize this debate captures something essential about the Colossus. It was never just metal and mortar, but a canvas for imagination and mystery. As you leave the library, the last light fades, and you notice the shadows around you lengthening, friendly giants welcoming you into the night. Maybe, just maybe, Helios's shadow still lingers, quietly watching over Rhodes. Picture this. You're wandering through the ruins of ancient Rhodes long after the Colossus's fall. The sun is low, casting a warm golden light on broken stones and twisted bronze fragments buried beneath centuries of dust. You pick up a small piece of metal and wonder what if the story didn't end here. That's right. Even though the statue lay shattered, its spirit lived on, inspiring later architects and artists across the Mediterranean. You hear whispers about the legendary influence of the Colossus on later monuments, set especially the famous Statue of Liberty, which some say was designed with a nod to the towering Helios. Sure, there's no concrete proof, but the similarities are intriguing. Both statues stand tall at the entrance of a harbor. Both symbolize light and freedom, and both have a certain larger-than-life vibe that makes you want to stand a little taller yourself. Interestingly, the concept of colossal statues guarding cities wasn't unique to Rhodes, but the Colossus set the standard for what colossal truly meant. Ancient engineers kept pushing boundaries, inspired by this bronze giant, yet, even as inspiration traveled through time, the Colossus's physical legacy faded. Some archaeologists believe that bits of the statue's bronze were recycled to make coins, tools, or smaller statues, linking the giant to everyday life in unexpected ways. There is also the story still debated of a secret chamber hidden beneath the statue's base, where sacred relics or inscriptions might be buried. No one's found it yet, and some scholars think it's just a fanciful myth. But you can't help but like the idea. Beneath the feet of a god, a hidden trove of ancient wisdom waiting to be discovered. As you wander the ruins, you realize the Colossus's legacy isn't just in what remains physically, but in the way it shaped human imagination, culture, and the very idea of monumental art. The giant sun god may have fallen, but his light still shines through history, reminding you that even the biggest dreams can leave a lasting mark. Hey guys, tonight we're reaching the final stretch of our journey with the Colossus of Rhodes, the giant bronze god who once stood tall over the harbor, now resting in stories and shadows. You might be feeling a bit like you've been wandering ancient streets for hours, maybe your eyes are heavy, or your mind is drifting, and honestly, that's perfect, because this moment is about letting history gently tuck you in. You've learned about the statue's towering presence, the myths, the mysteries, the debates that scholars still have over how it was built and how it fell. You've heard about the clever engineering, the recycled weapons, the shadow stories, and the lasting inspiration for future generations. And through it all, you've been walking beside Helios, feeling the sun's warmth on your face, and the sea breeze whispering secrets of a world long gone. So now, as you settle in, imagine that the bronze giant's story is folding softly around you like a warm blanket. The gentle hum of the harbor fades into a lullaby. The twinkling stars overhead blink sleepily, and the ancient city itself seems to breathe with calm. There's no rush here, no urgent need to unravel every mystery or solve every debate. Some things are meant to stay just out of reach, like the soft fading of daylight or the last whisper of a dream. You close your eyes and let the gentle pulse of history carry you, as if the spirit of Rhodes is rocking you to sleep on its ancient waves. Good night, and may your dreams be as grand and timeless as the Colossus itself.